All right. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, whichever time you listen to the podcast. This is the Grow Design Podcast, and my name is Emmanuel Mole. I used to have my co-host with me, Ini, but she's going to be joining us very soon on today's section. However, I have with me a very interesting guest, Hadi Kujal, and I can't wait to unravel the conversation with him today. It's going to be a very interesting one, talking about exploring the founder focused growth design in terms of you being a funding designer or a designer in the early startup or in a small team. How do you navigate your way around it? Before I start the conversation, I like to introduce Adi. Hi, Adi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Emmanuel. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome, awesome. Pleasure to also meet you, also and have you as a guest. So, Hadi, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I am a growth product designer based in London. My background has always been in design. I was born in Spain, where there's no design in school, and kind of always blended the worlds of art and engineering together when I was younger, and went on to study design a while ago. Went to design school in Newcastle, Northumbria, if anybody recognizes the design school. And I then went on quickly to shift from industrial design and more kind of physical design into the digital space. So I focused a lot on kind of fully immersive experiences, landing a gig at a product innovation agency, fell in love with the startup world, went in house. And recently I've been kind of tackling growth, product design more so on a fractional basis so I can work with more startups. Yeah, pleasure to be here and have a great conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Just curious right now. I think you kind of fortunate to have like a background in design. Like some of us just stumbled into design. I have an engineering background and I count it as it's a privilege for people like you to have studied design while in school and able to be practicing what you studied in school. I think it's going to be like an effortless shift. But I'm curious, like you talked about being a great product designer. How were you able to find yourself in that space as a good product designer?
A great part about design is that you're able to tap into your experiences and then leverage them in whatever field you choose to design for. And with growth product design, with growth design, really, there's a massive entrepreneurial kind of element to it. And for me, since I was maybe 13, 15, I was the lemonade stand kid who would sell lemonade on the streets, I had a million businesses when I was 18. It was always just kind of a bit of what seemed to be a boring thing for others, maybe seemed like a bit more of a fun game for me, just understanding how the world of business worked. So it was always a missing piece for me in design when I studied design. And the minute I started working with startups, it became more very apparent that actually it's a great skill to have, understanding how business works and how you can apply creativity to grow the business. And it's quite a kind of recent term, that's been coined, growth design. So for me, it kind of became apparent that it's something that I was applying when I was working in these earlier stage startups, in particular, a startup I work with called Otto, where my suggestions for solving certain problems stop relying on design in itself in the traditional sense of a app screen or a feature and started to rely more around experiences. And I started to draw inspiration from places which I usually wouldn't traditionally look at as a designer, like sales, like just spending a day looking at sales calls and seeing what can I learn from this. You mentioned you came from an engineering background, and I think leaning into what really interests you and your background to then fill the gaps that are there when you're designing is what makes a great designer, in my opinion. I love designers that have psychology backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, because the conversations you have, I've spoken to a lot of designers with traditional design backgrounds. Not that many have different backgrounds. So it's great to have those conversations because I always leave learning something new.
That's interesting. Interesting to know that talking about someone who has a background in design and saying other people when you have a background in other field, it's the way we talk and converse is different. I think that's really interesting. I think it's clear that you have an entrepreneurship spirit, like based on your background, right? I want to ask how important is having that entrepreneurship mindset as a designer when you work as an early stage startup, but you're not a founder, but how important is that mindset for you as a designer?
It's a good question. I think it's quite a personal answer coming from my own experience. I think For me, it's been incredibly useful. It's enabled me to bring kind of both design and business ideas to the table, which can often, in some places, earn you a seat at the table because often, if you're not talking in LTV, CAC, these kind of terms, people just view you as somebody that brings pretty images. Now, not so much the case, given that the whole startup world is quite educated on the impact that design can bring. But I think for me, having that entrepreneurial mindset and communicating it to stakeholders and whoever you're working with was very important, because a big element early on in the early stages is getting your ideas heard and getting them implemented. And a lot of the time, you can have the best idea in the world, but if you don't know how to sell it and how to be heard and how to be valued, those ideas that could make a big impact might just get brushed under the rug. And, that often comes from not explaining them in business terms, which as a designer is something you need to learn because it's not a traditional part of the journey.
It's great. I love the way you answer that. And so, in some of our conversation, you kind of mentioned that you didn't really kind of say you discovered growth design, but you've sort of been doing growth design before you even knew that's what it was called. So, can you elaborate on how you kind of unlock that aspect that, like, oh, yeah, this is growth design? And what was the aha moment for you? And how did it click that this approach to design in general is really great?
I think for me, the aha moment was when I started to connect the dots in terms of what really drives user decisions. So I think as a designer, you're always very empathetic. You spend a lot of time with users. You're there to represent the user. But often, not understanding the way they think, the psychology behind it, can lead you to make decisions that don't reap the results that you want them to. It's the typical thing of never go and ask a user, what do you want? I think hear about their problems and then use your expertise and knowledge in the kind of psychology field to understand what tactics and what methods you can best use for them to solve that problem. Often, if you just implement what somebody wants, when they actually start to use it, they're like, "Ah, I don't really know if I enjoy using this." So for me, kind of creating that link between psychology and users was one of the moments. And then the second one was when I started to realize the value that sales had in the design process. And I think that this is something that also started to really spike my curiosity around copy, value propositions. It's not just enough for somebody to have a great onboarding and an activation flow. As a user, you want to feel motivated and excited and sold and convinced that this is the right product for you. And that came a lot from just studying a bit of sales psychology, watching sales videos, watching the founder in the startup I work with do sales, and just look at people's faces when he describes certain features and processes, and what kind of questions do they ask, and what's their mood, when do they feel lost. So I think psychology in sales was probably the biggest aha moment. Then I got an email in my inbox from growth.design. Must have been 4 years ago those guys launched. And then everything just changed. I was like, oh, wow, okay, interesting. These are things I was realizing, but never was able to formalize into, particular principles, which I'm sure you also empathize with, Emmanuel. Like a big chunk of creating this love for growth design comes from, like, you're interested in all of these things, but nobody's created terms or frameworks for them. And then suddenly you see them put into a framework and you're like, oh, that's exactly how I kind of think about problems. And then you connect with people that think the same way and you suddenly unlock this whole world, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's the same thing. In fact, I think almost 90% of designers I've spoken to kind of have the same journey. And like they've have this, apart from the entrepreneurship spirit, but most of us do have because of our leaniness to want to know what really drives business. I think that aspect of the psychology part and the sales part, which you mentioned earlier, also is one of the aha moment that most designers do have. And I agree with you. And also the growth.design website, or should we call it a product now? Because it's what I product, it's a very great resources for designers to kind of get started in growth design. And I think it's also a great way to start. And I think I agree with everything you've said. So you work with a lot of early stage startup. What are the things that surprises you or that you find most challenging in such environment working as a growth designer?
Yeah. There's a million answers to that question because, again, based on personal experience. And I think one of the biggest challenges is lack of guidance and overcoming this feeling that you need permission to push through. Whereas if you have a solid rationale, you believe something, the data's there, you know your stuff, don't be afraid to really talk confidently and sell your decisions. Just because you don't have somebody in the room to say, I think that's a good idea, doesn't mean you shouldn't push for it. You're often the sole designer. So I would say, surround yourself with experienced designers. Very lucky now as designers, we have stuff like ADP list. If you're somebody more growth focused, then growth mentor is also great. And having that person that you can, I think you should have two types of people if you're a founding designer. The first one is somebody that's the exact same as you, where you could just have a coffee on a Friday when you're like either super happy or melting down and go, "How was your week?" Just have a buddy there with you.
Yeah.
I was very lucky. I had amazing people from when I early on in my career to in the middle and now, just great people. People love to help. And then the other type of person you should have, the second, is somebody that's maybe two steps ahead of you. So somebody who's maybe taken a startup from like seed stage, founder nightmare argument, here and there, selling your decisions, taking that to like Series A and been there the whole time. What does that look like? That helps a lot, having those two perspectives. Because on one hand, you're going to find out that you're human, you're normal, you're doing everything you should do. What you're feeling isn't crazy. And on the other hand, you're going to learn how to overcome that. So I would say that this is, and treat it as friends. People are friends. Like, don't kind of just look for a transaction. Find someone that maybe has similar interests as you. I think design by committee was also a big hurdle for me. So I
Mm.
think it's delicate because you want everybody in the team to feel like a designer so that they share their ideas, but know where the line is, that when you jump into Figma and you're making decisions based on rationale and whatnot, that these things are your responsibility and there is an element that you own. So it's a very delicate balance, and I wouldn't want anybody to go, design is my job, screw everyone else. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. But own your role and kind of, yeah, educate people about kind of design culture and like where their thoughts matter the most. And lastly, I would say, expect a heavy workload. You're going to learn so much. You're going to be spread in a million directions, but just, I would say, make sure you prioritize your time and ensure that, but if in 2 years you look back at what you were doing, did it help you get to the next stage, or are you just kind of being spread thin in a million directions? I would say be very, very aware of, like, in 2 years, what kind of a person do you want to become, and are you getting experience in those areas? I have a story which kind of contradictory to everything I just said, which is I got spread really thin in the early days and actually ended up editing some videos for some kind of different things, product walkthroughs, blah blah blah. And I was like, I'm a designer. I came here to design this product. It's going to be mine. I'm so excited. And I just lent into it, and I found the newfound obsession, editing and filming and going out and filming. Now a dream of mine is to go and travel the world and film food documentaries. And I love
Mm.
editing. I love content. And now, this is something I would have never considered as a hobby, potentially at someday a job. Who knows? So at the same time, even though I say prioritize your time, if something, try it. If it piques your interest, lean into it, because it's rare you get these opportunities where you have 10 jobs all at once. Usually you just have one thing that you have to focus on. So I think leaning into your curiosity was something I didn't expect that would be very beneficial.
Great, great. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about a funding designer role, a sole designer role, that you think is wrong, that people shouldn't be scared of?
I think there's a misconception that it's going to be very kind of glamorous work and that you're going to end up creating like a kind of trophy masterpiece product that's going to be beautiful with illustrations and animations. And, it often gets sold to you as like, you own this product, you have the power. And it's like, yes, but it also has to deliver on business goals. So I think that if you do join a startup, unless UI is a massive part of the experience, which in B2C it is, up to an extent, don't compare what you're building to like a Revolut or like a Headspace even, where, they have one team entirely designing content. You're one person, keep your sanity, have fun with it. But the glamorous approach, I think, is a misconception. Of course, it involves a lot of hard work. And within that, it gets tricky with the hard work because there's a lot of ambiguity where you don't really know what the hell you're doing. And then you realize the founders are like, well, you don't know, I don't know either. And it's like, does anybody know what we're doing? And so I think that ambiguity is there. But firstly, you're not going to know until you brainstorm, design it, and launch it and see what the result is. Just the process has the answers. I always like to think if you feel lost, build it, test it. So I think that can be solved with that. Nowadays, startups are so overly funded that I had an experience where, I didn't really have that many limited resources. If we needed to do a rebrand, we brought someone in, podcast stuff. We had somebody that was editing. I was working for a startup called Otto, a YC startup, and we were designing an app to help people manage their tinnitus. So a big part of it is like this podcast, high quality audio, a very warm experience, great UI. And we had people define the brand. We had people work on the podcast. So I actually wasn't hit by these limited resources, but I have friends working in early stage startups. You're building the entire thing. I know some people that are even almost coding it with no code tools. So I think that can be quite tricky for some people at times.
I can't agree less with you. So let's talk about, since you lean towards the resources aspect, right? So when you're working in a early stage startup, right, you're dealing with sometimes with sensitive data that kind of impacts people, and also looking at startup that don't have a large database, right? Often with limited resources, especially at early stage. How do you navigate the responsibility of making design decisions or choices, especially when it's like a new field entirely that has not been found? So how do you navigate that responsibility?
Yeah, so this is a good question and a very delicate question, especially if you don't have any experience working with health tech startups. One of my first experiences was just understanding like in how much trouble you can get if you don't get this wrong, both in terms of user risk and also in terms of money. You can get sued for a lot of money if you get this wrong. I think, in my experience, having founders that have really deep, deep knowledge on the topic that you're tackling was super useful. When I was working on this app with Otto, both of the co-founders were ex-military doctors. They had a good understanding of, we were designing a product that looked like a medical device, but it
Mm.
wasn't. So you're in that gray area where you could get done, but you're not gonna, and it's like this gray area. You need to be very careful that you cover your bases, and you cover your bases, as I said, with having knowledgeable co-founders. And I think I was very fortunate to have one or two experts in the field, psychologists as well, who I would bring into workshops and we'd brainstorm and they'd go, "You can't say that." And I'd, okay, done, changed. And yeah, I think as the months go by, you learn how they think and then you make less mistakes. But collaboration, workshops, again, it goes back to what I was saying about building a design culture within a startup and not everything being on you, because then you
Mm.
feel like the craft is your thing, but the decision making and thinking is collaborative. So you can avoid a lot of the potential risks or reduce the risks by having those two things: great founders and experts right next to you.
So for designers joining early stage startup, right, maybe even as the first hire, right, and the playing field is always different. In your experience, what are the skill sets that are absolutely important or essential for designers to really thrive and make impact in such a scrappy environment?
Literally speaking, I think you can't be somebody that spends 1 week designing a CTA. The scrappiness is super important, in terms of how fast you can go from conversation workshop to here's a prototype. Often it can be like 24 hours. Time is super scarce in these stages. So I think speed is just super important, and the attention to detail can come later once you have validated that what you're working on is going to make an impact. When you join a startup, like as a founding designer, I think one thing that's really important is that don't wait for people to tell you what to do. The best designers that I've seen work in kind of founding teams, I think have done a really good job at being really proactive, at finding what the problems are within the business, and then bringing ideas to the table. So you don't really rely on somebody coming and managing your day or your week for you. Instead, you might find a cool insight a user said, mock up a quick user flow, and then bring it to the founder or the product manager. I think that proactiveness is super important. Then, of course, you have the traditional skills you'd expect as from a design role, right? Figma, prototyping, this, that. But to have a fun time and to make your mark, I feel like those two, the
Hmm.
speed and proactiveness were very, very useful.
I think the proactive part of it is really essential, especially when you are in a place where everybody expects you to take initiative. You are the only one there. You just need to learn how to take initiatives and get stuff done. So, moving on to the next segment, right? It's been an amazing conversation so far, Adi. You talked about that aspect of you having people around you and also having a great communication skills, right? Communicating with founders around you. So, you work closely with founders. What are the effective way that a designer can communicate the value of design, especially a growth focused design, to a CEO that they will not just throw it under the carpet?
Yeah, this is a tough one depending on how focused the founder is on engineering or sales. Let's focus on the really stubborn people because I think that would be more interesting to look at. So if you're, say, I've worked with founders that are just like, this is not important, at all, and any convincing or any examples of other products and case studies that do it well won't convince them. Unfortunately, you have no other choice but to basically just break whatever idea you have down into a tiny experiment, and you better be confident it's going to deliver some results. Sometimes you only have one shot, and just run it, but in a way that makes it so effortless for the founder, where they just have to say yes or no. Try and make it nice and easy for them to say yes. And the minute that drives results towards the goal that they're trying to achieve, it then diverts their attention a little bit. They're like, oh, that kind of creative idea that I thought wasn't that interesting is moving the needle. What if we do 10 of them? And then you start to kind of move from I have this big idea that I want to implement, to why don't we just run this quick experiment? It'll take like 2 hours. So I think that kind of experimentation, proactive approach works quite well. Lecturing them on the value, on the impact design has on business is not worthwhile because they're just like, prove it. The founders are very like results driven. So I wouldn't I wouldn't suggest putting together a presentation. I've done that. Doesn't work for me, at least. And I think once you start to launch a few of these experiments and get them on board, I think then showing them that you know your stuff in terms of the ROI of these experiments, which can be hard at the early stages. Drop in a few terms to be part of the conversations. Even if you often you can, just throwing the term LTV in a random conversation just sparks their attention. You don't even, I've put so much work into trying to make it coherent, but I've often just thrown it in a presentation and they're like, oh, okay, this will affect it. So I think it's, you're confident about your ability. You know what you need to do to start to move the needle. It's getting their attention, really, and prioritizing it. So start small, but dream big with it. So I think that would be my advice with that.
Yeah, that sounds like a motivational talk too, but sounds start small, then dream big. All right. Okay, over to you, Ini.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm just wondering because you said let's talk about the stubborn ones. I'm wondering in your experience, is there any that pops into mind if you're able to talk about it?
Yeah, I won't drop any names, but I've worked with the stubborn ones. Tended to be the one actually, it's only been one, where they essentially were first time founders. They had read tons of kind of books and they were quite educated, but it kind of came down to a little bit of personality characteristic where they weren't very good at delegating, bit of micromanaging, kind of came down to being too confident on what they read online instead of kind of bringing someone in to just encourage them to do their best work. I think they were just, as people as well. I've been to dinner with some of these founders and it's like, like even the conversations, it's fairly methodical and close-minded. It's so I think it's quite rare. I think where maybe people will empathize a bit more with this is when you have a team where you have a product manager, say two co-founders, and your ideas are usually being put to the bottom of the list because you aren't able to articulate the impact that they're going to have.
Mm,
And that will probably be the,
yeah.
the product manager saying, no, we're not going to focus on that, we're going to focus on this instead, because you just failed to kind of initially it's very hard to have them understand why it could be high impact. So I think that probably is a little bit would resonate a bit more with people. I think in general, most founders that are tackling cool problems tend to be like the best people and like super fun to work with. So I don't want to even focus on people that are a nightmare, because you should just leave the team if that's the case.
Hard agree on that, honestly. Okay, so you've been in a position to have to advocate for a design decision that they were hesitant about, right? I want practical steps now. How did you approach the conversation? What did you say? And then when you worked out, how did that work out for you?
So I think when working in smaller teams, what you focus on as a team kind of gets all grouped together. Like if you're recording podcasts and you're designing some screens, doing some marketing, it tends to be that the product manager will kind of, prioritize everything together. So the ways that I have essentially pushed my ideas is, for example, I was working for a startup called Otto, and we had a lot of time selling this new product we launched, a one-to-one product, through a typical landing page sales funnel. You drive Google traffic, you book an appointment, we upsell you. And I kept on reiterating
Mhm.
that this is not how you sell a almost a £1,000 product, because it was a long program. People don't just jump on a call and press buy. You need to nurture them. They want to get to know us, who's behind it. They want to get to know other people that are joining the program. So in the back of my head, I initially pushed for creating an event section in the app, which we had an app as like a lead capture to run events and nurture people and then upsell them. And it was just instantly kind of shut down because it's a massive kind of feature to push through. I was still kind of building
Mm.
my kind of business language knowledge to articulate these things back then. So instead, what I decided to do was to go away and say, okay, well, what if we launch webinars? And they were like, you would never be able to sell this product on a webinar. So I was like, okay, well, if I put together a webinar and I get, say, 30 people signed up, can I get one of the co-founders to come in and I'll run it? You just do you 30 minutes of your time, answer questions, see how it goes. And I think that's where the
Yeah.
proactive thing comes into play, because I think I had to learn how to do that in through great mentors and people a bit ahead of me, to then know that that was a piece of the puzzle to get to this event screen that I wanted to implement. We had great results. We ended up selling a ton of these programs. It became our main sales funnel, these webinars. And then they were like, well, oh, okay, so what if you don't have to use email? What if the webinars are just in the app? And then we have a past webinar recording section so people get nurtured. And then suddenly these dots start to connect. But as I said previously, you need to show one little success to build faith into the big idea, because there's people that are really good at this and they're amazing salesmen and they're ideas people, well, founders pretty much.
Yeah.
But when you're in a big
Yeah.
team, it's very hard. I think just get super creative. If you want to build a big feature in an app and you think it's going to have a big impact, what's the version of that feature that you could test in real life? Because it could
Mm.
literally be going up and down your WeWork or wherever you have an office or online, and just testing it, just getting some real data behind it.
I absolutely love how you said like the faith in the small things and using those as levers for bigger things, right? Because for example, I actually work in a very, very large design org. Like there are about over 120 designers on the team, right? And we all belong to different squads and all of these things. And I can easily see how every time when I came in, I was like, okay, from experience, you can't come in guns blazing and say these are the things that need to change around here. I can see all the issues clearly. But how do I dumb this down to the tiniest of ideas? Also, because it's also great for building your own reputation, like you said. It works the same way whether you're an in house designer or you're working with a founder. You need to establish that sense of trust. You need to establish the reason why they should listen to you. Even though, yes, you've been hired, your teammates are still going to look at you with a bit of, okay, you don't have any social capital on this team yet, right? So it's those find the quick wins. Is why they say quick wins, very important. And quick wins do not necessarily translate into massive things. It can be the quick, easy fixes here and there that then create that access, like you said, lead into the bigger idea. Because I can give a practical one on my end, which is actually not my idea. It's my partner's idea. But when you join an organization doing the same thing, right? And it's one tiny idea that then became the biggest revenue builder for the company for over 8 years, quite frankly. Like it became their biggest source of income, right? So it's those type of things. And I can imagine if he had joined the company and then said, hey, here's my pitch. People are gonna look at you sideways like, are you okay? Right? So it's finding those little things that can then create that venue for bigger stuff. So now in thinking about this for when you're setting up experiments with limited data, right? Because we know this is gold for us great designers. We do need that data. But in early days, it's a different picture. Very early days, it's scarce, you don't have access. Some founders like to get into the middle of the weeds themselves, and they're the ones who have all of that. And they may not necessarily give you that level of access, also, because this is their baby and it's new, right? So, how do you get creative and resourceful in validating your design decisions or running an experiment when you have little to no data?
That's a tough one. Now, currently, I'm working with a startup that is kind of in, yeah, Series A, close to B, growth state. So, it's like just experiment up the metric. And it's so different to when you're like, we have this product that someone built in like a week, so like an MVP, and add all these features that we think create all this stuff. And the data that they have is also not great because it's not very clear because you're not tracking the right things. You're like, but all you're telling me is the conversion rate. I don't what the do you know anything else that's happening in the front? They're like, no. So I think it's a really tough one. I start in two places. One of them is you're always going to have access to one type of data and you can really trust it. User data, right? Qualitative data. And that's where being a really good researcher is super important in these early stages. And I found that learning how to almost be a good like therapist, like having people
Mm,
open up and tell you these long stories is like
mm,
essential, because when I first learned how about research, it was quite methodical, and when it became something that gave was more fruitful was when it was like just become someone's friend, because that's when they're going to tell you the truth. Nobody
Yeah.
tells you the truth in the first go. So I think that qualitative user kind of deep dive super important. And then I'm a big advocate for, like, I don't know if you've seen this book called Steal Like an Artist, but like in the early
Yeah.
stages,
gotta
you
still.
need, yeah, like just go for it. Like no, there's no shame. Don't just copy paste, but study like a thief almost. Like, well, thief like study like yeah, basically steal and
Yeah,
study and repeat. Like
yeah.
if you're building a product that is for in the health tech space, let's say for IBS, and somebody's building a product that's for managing menstrual cycles, say like flow, or something that revolves around something physical that you're managing, and these guys are 5 years ahead. Look at what works, look at what doesn't, why doesn't it work, start to create rationales, hypotheses on why they use things, and then strip it down and bring it into whatever you're doing and apply your language, your copy, your emotions from your users. And I think you end up with a pretty solid product to start off if you just spend a month or two like interviewing, stealing, piecing together, Frankensteining as well as you can this product, and then become best friends with your product manager. If you're lucky, you have a product manager that wants to get better at design and you want to get better at product managing. That's the best scenario. I've had that scenario. It's like, and he was my good friend. So it was just great. So
Hmm.
just getting super close to the data and making sure that once you do build something, you're tracking all the right stuff. In a couple of months, you'll be out of that feeling of I have no data, and you'll be pretty sweet, I think.
I love that. I really like that. You know what? You were talking about being great at listening, right? I cannot remember the book right now, but I was reading a book that was talking about user research. And it was more around how he had been interviewing people. And there was a particular couple that they wore black. We're coming from a funeral. And obviously in their black outfit. And they had gone to like an eatery quickly, just went and got some food. And they sat down and they made pretty drastic decisions to their lives. And obviously, when he'd been interviewing them, they were just talking about how they changed their lives completely. But then the point was, as he spent more time just asking them questions and digging in, he realized that what was different when he had asked them what they were wearing that day, their answer had been they were both wearing black. And he was like, what's the context around that? And realized, oh, they were coming back from a funeral. So it was basically they just buried a very good friend of theirs. And that prompted them going to this eatery to sit down and make drastic life changes to how they saw their lives and the impact they wanted to make. And suddenly that was the lead in for him. But if you're just like on surface level talking to people, you may miss those kinds of stories which then show the true impact. So for his clients, apparently it was not so much so the service that he provided that helped these people achieve what he wanted, but it was more because it was the life stories. So oftentimes he was just saying, like, as a roundup, like some of the questions you need to ask when it comes to user research could be triggering questions that help people remember what were they doing in the moment, those recall questions, right? Just as an example to what you were saying about how you have to practice listening, because it's only when you listen you hear those in between moments that you can pull on.
I think that's a really good
Yeah.
point, especially when thinking about the way your people, if you Google typical user research stuff, I remember it's all quite methodical and it's like, product focused. But when you just start to approach it from an emotional standpoint, like you just said, tell me about a time that you tried to do X thing, activity based, not product, like just talk about their life, treat them like a person. This isn't an interview. You're so right. The stuff that really impacts, because then the quality of their answer is entirely based on that experience, right? So it's a good point, and it's super hard skill. It's super
It
hard skill to.
is.
I'm still
It
learning.
is. Oh no. Honestly, I'm waiting for the person who would actually tell me that they figured it out. I mean, some people have, but I want to hear them so they can share the story with me on whatever it is or how they improved on those things, right? But I guess it's also practice on our side. So, how did you even begin to approach like growth design experiments when you were working with early stage in those scenarios where you don't have those data, right? You talked about then leaning into that listening skill. But beyond the listening skill, is there anything else in your toolkit that you utilized for helping you then run these experiments with limited data?
Yeah, again, it's quite hard when you live in a world that's all assumptions, and
Mm.
you're like prioritizing assumptions, and it's like we're just sat here prioritizing our opinions all day. Like we don't even know what's gonna work or not. You've got to start somewhere and you got to work with what you've got. So I think starting with assumptions that you have strong confidence in, which are basically just strong opinions that
Yeah.
everybody agrees on, is a good place. Again, as similar to kind of the having no data stuff, qualitative data is always going to be there, and you can test your assumption and eventually your hypothesis with that qualitative data. Like, if we solve this, will it even make an impact to everything we've heard? No, maybe we're poking in the wrong direction. I think in general, like the growth design experimentation stuff is very hard in the early stage startup stage in the traditional sense of like, let's focus on a funnel and let's increase conversion. You've heard it a million times.
Yep.
But it's like we're looking at the funnel, the activation, the churn, the this, the that, the your referrals all at once. So you're like, you probably need to run around 400 experiments until you start to plateau a little bit. You don't have time for that. I think the best way that I have seen it applied in startups that I really enjoyed was user insight based assumptions that we would create. So we have all of these user pains that pop through, and then we're gonna have 30 minutes every Tuesday, and we're gonna come up with assumptions based on this data, and then we're gonna ideate on the most impactful and also sometimes fun experiments we can run. And each week we run one experiment, but we don't spend more than 4 hours on it, let's say, as a team. And it becomes this team building thing where after a few months you get this big win and you're like, let's keep on doing this. It takes like literally 4.5 hours a week with development time. So, I think you got to keep it fun. Not, you can't get too granular with the data here. Just make sure that it's roughly focused towards the user kind of research that you're getting.
Mm.
And I think that's the best way I've seen it applied. I think when you just put blind focus into a funnel in the early stages, you might be missing out on so many other parts of the product that you really need to work on. So you also just don't have the resource, I think. So that fun experimentation I found to be really, yeah, really, really impactful.
Yeah, one of the things I miss right now about small teams is that early stage energy. You know what? I actually wanted to ask you more on that. I remember that I think it was Elena Werner. I was reading a blog. I might be wrong. I think it was her blog, I was talking about the different Slack channels that they've got for experiments and things, and then how they've got an oh shit channel where it's more when things don't do well. You're also reporting on that as well. So it's not just about because the reality of growth experiments is that you're going to have more losses than you have wins,
Yeah.
right? But as a way of continuously sharing the learnings and keeping everybody in the loop, because you've talked about the team building activity. As a solo designer, oftentimes you're more of a consulting type relationship with these companies, right? How do you integrate on that part? I'm curious. How do you integrate with those team structures? And if they don't have things existing, are you the one setting those systems up for them and things like that?
It's tricky because I think so. Recently, I was telling Emmanuel, I kind of shifted from, last year having more full time work and then taking on kind of growth product design, fractional roles, but where I do what you said, the implementation of sometimes data and or like a way to capture data, but then also implement the design. So it actually works really well with these early stage startups. So selling them on the idea that like you're going to get somebody that's, loves kind of the business side, scrappy, but also will design for you. They're like, oh, wow. So we get two in one. So I don't know how, but it's worked out quite well on that end, given that they don't have much money as well. But so on the actual like working with smaller startups and growth design, they love the pitch. Then it's as you're right. When it comes to implementing, it can be very hard with fractional work because you want to try and maintain your sanity by having a process that you stay true to, but then you also need to adapt to their way of communicating. The way I like to do it is I like to tell them that I go through an onboarding period with them where we're going to take 1 week that of course we'll tackle your work, but like let's get our communication right, let's get our working structure right, let's have some every on Friday, let's have some feedback. What do you not like? What do you like? I'm not going to leave if you don't like something. Just tell me and we'll fix it. But I treat it, it sounds nerdy, but I treat it like a product. Like, if you onboard somebody and you set expectations and you hear them, you're like, they have to feel heard or else it's like this dictatorship. You're on your way to have something that's fairly standardized across different startups. And I think your question about do I go in and implement stuff for them? I tend to try and not to because then I tend to try and have very clear kind of barriers in terms of what I do and what I don't do because that's when you start to go into the employee part, which I love. But if you work for one company, I would be working like 90-hour weeks if I would be implementing stuff for them. So what I try to do is support them as much as I can with resources. Again, the friend stuff comes into play where it's like, you know, trust me, I'm here for you, hard, easy. I'm here for you anytime to support you. Like it's not just design, it's an emotional thing for a lot of people. So I try to guide as much as I can. Lots of looms, on how I would do it, but I'm not going to actually do it. Pretty much that, I think. Those two things, good onboarding and just being there for people, I think, is enough to kind of get them to do the work.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. And you're telling me you're still working on your sales pitch, sir. you That's really great. Okay, yeah, talking about sales, you're a big advocate on incorporating sales psychology and behavioral science into design. Can you share a specific example of a time where you used the behavioral notch, a psychological principle, something that then really moved the needle for the startup's growth?
Yeah, this is quite a recent thing, which I always sales is like the enemy of designers. Like it's like this corporate thing. Why would I even, look at that? Like I'd never want to wear a suit. I mean, I'm talking this traditional design kind of world. It's like that. It's kind of wearing it's wearing like a shirt but I really fell in love with it because I fell in love not with the money making aspect of it, but the psychological aspect of it of like I really had a bad relationship with it because I viewed it as this kind of used car salesman. Like, you don't need this car, but I'm going to sell it to you, this like penny stock broker. But when you start to look at it as like, how do really good salespeople convince somebody that this is the perfect product for them? Because it is. And you study how those people work and how they conduct interviews and what they use to create presentations and pitches, and then there's so much you can take and apply into your design craft. So one instance that I had where that was very apparent is we didn't have access to a copywriter. I mean, we did, but they were kind of freelance, very kind of quick, scrappy. They discovered ChatGPT. It got even worse. That was like the first iteration of it, and nothing was converting. We had an app onboarding. I think it was also working for this company called Auto, and we were doing a lot of one-to-one sales pitches, sales calls, and I essentially was like, he's selling the product on these sales calls. He's having their eyes, the founders having their eyes light up, go down, handle objections. They're then asking them questions with their own words. And if you look at 10, 15 sales calls, you look at there's words and sentences that are very common. Take them, copy them, throw them into a good place in your onboarding. Like, this is literally just a space to have people feel heard, have some empathy, which is the best ways through language and words. So watching sales calls for me and learning, like, how do you, in the end of the day, you're a designer designing a product, but like, if no one's buying this stuff, then what's the point? So to me, that sparked basically a massive gap in my knowledge. I was like, I don't know how people sell this stuff. Let me learn.
Mm.
So learning that eventually resulted in a big increase in my sales knowledge and then conversion in general, which I've tried to apply again and again and again. And I think it's also very apparent when you look at physical sales cycles. So, the way people sell, say, I'm working with an ADHD company at the minute, the way somebody sells an ADHD diagnosis and their sales process, you could basically learn so much and apply it to your onboarding. So, yeah, a lot of magic there in the sales world.
Okay. So, yeah, we know that there is magic there, but you also have to admit that if we don't use it carefully, as with anything, and put humans in front of almost anything, if it's not carefully used, there's the other side of it. Now, so how do you balance that use of persuasive design techniques with ethical considerations? Especially, you've worked in a field like health tech where trust is important.
You need to constantly check yourself, because the minute that conversion becomes the most, we have to find a new word for this, because I'm like, conversion is just all the time everywhere. But the minute conversion is repeated again and again and again, you start to become this like sales business machine, and you forget that there's a human going through your flow. It's a really good question, and I think there's some great resources out there that you can read to up your knowledge around like ethical design. I think Sarah Tajima has a sustainable design playbook, growth design in their course. I think at the end they talk a lot about, we've now told you how to increase conversion, but don't fall into the dark patterns like Adobe. They're like kings of dark patterns. I don't know if you've tried to cancel their stuff, but
Oh,
terrible.
yeah. I got hit with like a $400 charge. I'm like, I will just wait till March 2025. That's all I'm waiting for. It's fine.
It's just terrible, right? I think like, you live such a in the early days as well, when it's all about like people and not like just software. It's really bad. And how do you check yourself? I think the only real way is to get the knowledge, know what mistakes people make, and at the end of a design, sprint, look at it and go, are we squeezing money out of people here? Are we genuinely doing it to benefit the product?
All right. So now, looking at new designers who are new, or just designers in general who are new to behavioral science, and they really want to start applying these principles to their work, what would be your advice on that?
Yeah, I think I was talking to Emmanuel about this earlier. I mean, this is specific to people in behavioral science kind of moving into something like growth design, right? I'm assuming. So you're saying they're kind of shifting over and they want to learn how to transfer those skills. It's a tough question to answer, but I think that again, it's going to take some time for you to start to connect the dots between what work were you doing previously in which the behaviors mirror in product. Like, what kind of principles are you aware of that mimic the way the product behaves? I think there's no like clear cut answer as to like, how can somebody with a behavioral science background apply those principles. But I think it just takes a lot of time for you to, yeah, it's a tough question to ask, Kenny, actually. I'm trying to think, how can they, I think a lot of times this comes quite naturally, this kind of stuff. I think I've worked with behavioral scientists on a fintech product, and the principles of like people, I think like hyperbolic discounting, it's like a principle that somebody brought up. People don't like big rewards. They like
Mm,
the promise of a big reward, but a little reward at the start. It's like, You want to save up for a house? How much do you want to save up? £5 a day? Oh, that's nothing. Yeah, but in 10 years, that's going to be 20 grand and you'll have a house. Oh, wow. Okay. That
Hmm.
way of working. And I'm personally not a behavioral scientist, so I wouldn't be able to attest on how they create those links. But I think being very clear on the problem they're trying to solve and applying certain principles to get people to act and prompt them to actually take action to solve the problem. Then they start to think about, okay, like, so we want people to save for a house. How can we do that with these principles we know? Oh, well,
Hmm.
hyperbolic discounting is a good one. We could basically say that £5 a day and then they get a house after 5 years or a deposit. That kind of stuff I've seen
Hmm.
constantly works super well. And when people bring that up, I mean, it's amazing. You look at it, you're like, wow, it sounds genius because the principle is so well defined and written. And
Hmm.
so that's my personal experience with it.
And if you take in the context of just designers who are moving into growth design, right? Would your advice stay the same?
So yeah, for somebody, I think now you actually need to just move to growth design or you're gonna get cut out unless you're working for a Google or a Meta, right? Because like there was a point in time in which funding was just insane and design teams were a team of 10 at like seed stage and it was just so crazy and you didn't have to prove like the value of it. We're at a time now where founders want to see that how your designs move the needle. And I've spoken to designers that can talk about in that manner and some that don't. And the ones that don't are just waiting for a resource like, say, just a growth design school or a growth.design, or waiting for a resource they can get stuck into to be able to change the way they work because it's become like super, super, super important. I mean, I think you need to have an interest in it though, in the first place, because it's a hard thing to then start talking in business terms if you're not even kind of interested in it in the first place, because there's places for you to thrive without constantly having to focus on conversion. I think that definitely isn't said enough, that designers don't all need to be business focused. You can get
Hmm.
creative and find a space where you fit in. Yeah, that's
Okay.
what I.
All right. Wait, I'm gonna challenge that last statement though, right? And then I'll
Mhm.
pass it off to you now. So talking about designers, not all designers have to be business focused. Do you not think, in your opinion, the way the world of work is evolving and the fact that there is that constant justification that's necessary for how design adds value, would that
So
not be would it yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think that to me is different. So value and business value, and so value is the umbrella topic, and then within that you have business value, value to an experience, which can be hard to quantify. Design can be
Fair.
very hard to quantify, so I'm not saying that your design doesn't have to be quantifiable. I think that's very important because you need to show the value of what you're doing, definitely.
Hmm.
But I think that having revenue and business metrics and growth front, right, and center
Mhm.
sometimes can basically lead you down a path where it's just conversion focused, and there's parts of the journey which the increment is so marginal in the way the experience improves. It's very hard to quantify how this long journey that's empathized users throughout has then led to the conversion that it delivers, because a founder might just go, "Oh, it's a paywall." Well, it's they've gone through like 30 screens where we've like done this
Hmm.
beautiful demonstration of what they're going through and empathize, and there's designers that are really good at that, and quantifying that is very hard. So I think that's where I was trying to come from with the my view on not all designers need to be business focused. It's a very tricky one, this stuff, quantifying design. I've seen it pop up on
Yeah.
LinkedIn quite a lot. It's very hard. I'm not quite sure where I stand with it, but definitely stand with the fact that there's certain types of design that are just hard to quantify. Just make
Mhm.
sure that you don't do that design day in and day out. I think, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I work directly with the business unit. That's the team, the squad level I work with, and it's literally day in, day out. So I feel like I do need for speed when it comes to quantifying the ROI of my designs. It's every single day nonstop. So, but then there are beautiful moments in there where it's just the beauty of the design is what we're looking for. And someone says, oh no, it's just the landing page. It's not an experiment. And I'm like, yes, bring on the visual skills, right? So yeah, I do agree with you. I don't know where I stand either, to be fair, because I think it matters, the context of work matters.
Yeah.
And for certain designers, yes, your work will lean more towards that. As a whole, do all designers in the world need to understand business? Maybe at a very basic level, enough that they can carry on conversations and understand impact. But to really dig in the way you'd expect of growth designers and things, I think I see those conversations and I'm like, I'll raise you one that we still need other forms of design and things like that. Like it's all integral and necessary. And okay, on the last controversial question thing, right? There is also that thing around we should all be generalists. Like we are now moving into a world of generalist ICs. And we're seeing that cut down happen quite a lot when it comes to people managers or people who are strictly people managers, right? And not the player coach ones, right? And I wonder what your thoughts are on the way that the industry is evolving in that direction.
I think it's like such a big unknown, right? Given even Figma releasing this, what seems to be decent AI, tool where you just create rats, it steals designs, it makes new ones, it's stealing. I feel like it's stealing. But anyways, I think again, people voicing their opinions on LinkedIn, they say it like this should be this way and that way. It's all opinions. I think if I speak for kind of my world of like, that kind of seed series A, you are a generalist by default. But I think when looking at you're, because you have to kind of understand a little bit of everything and potentially do everything except code. Some people can even code now, which is so impressive. But when you're looking at companies that are a little bit bigger, I think maybe not being a generalist in the sense of knowing how to do a little bit of everything, but understanding how everything works. Because I think as tools become easier to use, your value is going to lie in understanding like the why, understanding the processes that can solve that why, which are the what, and then like implementing it, which is like the how. I think if you're somebody that's just stuck into one particular like discipline as a designer, just like broadening all of that to have more general knowledge is very good, because you'll soon have access to tools that will, you don't need to know how to code or need to know how to do X, but you need to know like what the right way to do it is. I think so. For myself, I'm one of those designers that people don't really like to talk about this AI stuff, because I love it. Because to me, the idea of like I get to like do everything all the time and learn and like implement things myself opens up this massive door of like, as designers, we're like the perfect people to start a product. But there's coding things where you have to learn. There's there's all these things that now with tools you're going to be able to implement. So I find it to be a super exciting stage. Like, I feel like there's going to be so many designer founders out there with amazing ideas. I can't wait for, I want more people to start companies. I want to see all of that, because it's just like the time for designers to shine, in my opinion. So I don't know why people are so scared about losing their jobs. I mean, just I think you're also not gonna lose your job. I feel you're just gonna end up doing a little bit less deep Figma work, right? But
Yeah.
you're still gonna keep your job.
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see it here.
Yeah, I think I agree too. Just like how me and Ini used to say that it's people that don't know how to utilize this tool, these new innovations that will get pushed out of the job. Once you get yourself aligned and know how to utilize it to your advantage, I think you're just going to get the best out of it, other than the tool or the new innovations getting the best out of you. So, trying to looking at bringing the conversation to a close, it's been a very, very interesting conversation so far. Looking at your personal experience now, looking at the ups and downs of startups, what are the most valuable lessons that you like to share that are good or bad?
So I think I'll start with the dark downs. And I think the worst is like, I think everybody's gonna get imposter syndrome. But I think the hardest part for me was letting this feeling of like, do I know what I'm doing? Am I the right person to do this? Get to me. And honestly, people have tried to, you talk to people who haven't actually been in that position and tried to give you advice, and it's a bit tricky. You never really get over that fear until you do. In my head, I did two things: was find somebody that's been in your position, and you'll realize every single person has felt that way. And the second, you know, every single week's gonna get better. Like this is like knowing that this is the worst you're gonna feel, that tomorrow you're gonna
Mm.
do something new and a bit scary, but you're gonna do okay and you're gonna get there, and then the next day, and then take it a day by time. You're no day is gonna be as bad as today. So then that gives you a bit of hope. Okay, I could probably do tomorrow. I think for me that was a big thing to get over. Then talking to founders and realizing that they feel the same thing. But no, I also don't really know what on earth I'm doing. And I actually feel even worse because I need to pay your wage. So like, if this goes down under, you don't have a job. Imagine that. I was like, oh wow, okay. You need to just deal with it. So that for me, those downs were quite tough. The ups were like you are talking about an idea in a room on Monday, and on Friday somebody's using it in the app, and on the Monday that comes next you get a message saying, I haven't been able to take my kids on a walk all weekend in the park. This feature or app thing that you did allowed me to do that. And then you talk to them and they start crying. Like this is like the ultimate level of feeling purposeful in life. And I think if you have that, I used to write down these kind of feedbacks and comments and like put them in a, not even a jar, I just put them in my drawer and like sometimes just read them. Like just to remind you, we forget that we're useful and we're doing
Mm.
something useful. And as humans, I think we're so busy, we need to like remind ourselves like you've done good work. Like remind yourself, pick yourself up. I think that was the biggest up.
Yeah.
The biggest up I've ever had has always been those moments. I remember
Mm.
them clearly, like even in my head. Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question though. It's a great question actually. Makes you think a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. Definitely. I think talking about imposter syndrome, right? If every designer can come to that self actualization that it's a normal thing to feel that way, I think a lot of us we get out of it very fast, right? And the truth is, no matter how skilled, no matter how creative you are, you definitely gonna have a day where you're gonna feel like, am I really doing something that's make a lot of sense? Like you're just gonna doubt yourself. But I like some of those steps that you highlighted that get yourself out of it, and also the other part of the win you mentioned. I think it's a good practice that every designer should do. Just like word of affirmation, when you tell yourself great things, it's good to remind ourselves that I've done something that is quite impactful, and I think that would really, really help balance, the good and bad, and ensuring that you keep growing in your creative journey. So,
Yeah.
this is
Emmanuel, sorry. Can
yeah,
I share an unhinged thing that I do?
sure.
Basically, I have a achievements folder where I save all of these things, screenshots of things. And for those moments where I feel low or things are not going according to what I like and all of that, I actually go through that and then literally read it out to myself, like say my name, like you are that
Mm.
person who did this. Like it's not unhinged, but like yeah. Well, the unhinged part is the fact that I actually there's something we call oriki in Yoruba language, which is like your family, the way your family gets
Energy.
greeted. Yeah, exactly. So, like, you actually get pumped up when you listen to your family's entire history being sung that way. And I sing my achievements that way
Mm.
because, hey, it's who's gonna big you up if you don't do it
Yeah,
for yourself?
yeah,
So,
definitely,
Yeah, that's
definitely.
great. I love that. I love that. And I think I heard someone something tell me something similar to do, which was you feel scared of like where you are now, think how far you've come. Like just think
Mm.
about where you were a year ago and where you are now, and then you're like,
True,
oh wow, I did that. Okay, let's go,
true,
let's do it. And I
true.
think you're right. Like if you don't remember and you don't look back, and then you don't, we humans think they're smart. You forget the most important stuff like that. So I think that's great
Yeah,
practice. In I really
yeah,
like that.
definitely, definitely. So, what are your advice that you would give to designers who are considering joining a early stage startup, or kind of maybe are currently in one? What are the green flags to look for and red flags you should watch out for?
Green flags to look for and red flags. I'll start with the red, and then we can finish this question on a good tone. So I
Good.
think avoid companies that are super focused on branding early on, and the product is just left for later. Like, it should literally be, we talk to users every week, we're building this product, but we don't have knowledge, we want to make it better. And this is where you're going to, as a designer, you're going to shine. So I think that to me, the focus is quite important. And the reason is because as a founder, I've seen it a lot of times, things aren't going well. So what's easier than building a product people love? Hiring a branding agency and making something look pretty. The hard stuff is making the product people want. So of course, marketing is very hard. I'm not diluting that, but just be wary of that. That's pretty much it, really, I would say, as red flags. I think I wouldn't want to let anything put anyone off because you never know, don't want to judge
Yeah,
a book by the cover.
sure. Because
And for green,
expresses differs.
yeah, for sure. And then for green flags, I would say founders that are like that deep understanding of their users, founders that value good design. And by good design, I mean also like aesthetic design, stuff that looks good, not stuff that's like, half baked. You're not there to educate founders on the value of design. You're going to be fighting that battle every single day if they don't get it. Like it there is every founder I've worked with except one has got the value. Easy, done. Like that's a massive part of your battle done. You're gonna have a better time if they get it from the get-go. If you can now, before accepting the job, just go out for there's something I did twice really recently, like now remote, but go for dinner. Like be like, can I take you for dinner because I'm someone that really values, have like relationships, and I like to work closely with founders. So can we just go get dinner and spend 2 hours and like don't talk to them about work? Like, how does he live a life? Like, is he somebody that's like knees deep in work and is is he somebody that likes to have fun? Is he see if you get along? I think because I've got along with all the founders I've worked with, and they're now really good friends of mine. And the startups, some of them are not there anymore. Some of them are doing really well, but they're still there. Those relationships. So
Mm.
yeah, building that relationship, I would say that's it. Just go for it, do it. If the risk is not on you, it's on them. They're the one hiring you and paying you a salary. If it turns out to be like the worst experience ever, stick it out for 3 6 months, and if it's a nightmare, find something new, but you won't know until you try it.
Great, great. I think I like the way you answered that, and I think one thing that really stands out to me from also my experience working with founders is when you have a founder that really understand the value of design. I think it makes life so easy for you as a designer. All the on the flip side, it's always a scrappy and messy environment, especially when the founder is just a not a yes person, just like even when you do something so scrappy, you yourself know this is scrappy. They just like, yeah, okay, okay. I think when you find yourself in such scenario, it's very tricky because sometimes you might find yourself not developing or not growing as a designer in the early stage startup because nobody's giving you quality or good feedbacks that could really challenge you enough to improve your skill. And that's kind of where I see having a very good founder who understand the value of design and in terms of aesthetics also. Definitely, and I would pass over to you need to wrap up the session. It's really, really been an interesting conversation with you, Adi. Over to you, Ini.
All right. Thank you so much, Adi. This has been great. Can you quickly tell us where people can find you online and learn more about your bag?
Yeah, sure. I mean, recently I'm trying to get into LinkedIn and share some work on there. So best to find me there. And that's pretty much it, really. If you want to find me on Spotify for some playlists, that's also a good place. If you're a
Okay, I
designer,
will
hopefully.
check you out.
Same me, I go check you up too.
All right. So, any final words of wisdom for designers who are excited about the potential of growth design?
Words of wisdom is, it's just an opinion until you test it.
I love that. Hmm, I love that.
So we are the lightning round. Takes a lot of time, but now I want us to be precise, like Adi. So top three products you use daily and you love.
A radio app, which is a super cool app to listen to radio from around the world. Spotify, and my photos app on my iPhone because I like to look at pictures of my travels every day.
One design resource you keep going back to every day.
I keep on going back to Mobbin, but actually recently, Sarah Tajima's Sustainable Growth Playbook. That's really good.
Three books you'd like to recommend to the designers out there.
The Creative Act by Rick Rubin is incredible. Listen to the audiobook. The Creative Confidence by, I forget what his brother is called, but Tom Kelly. And this is not even design related, but Kitchen
Sure.
Confidential by Anthony Bourdain is.
Cool. What profession would you have been if you were not a designer?
I would have been a food travel documentary producer. Yeah.
Interesting. What's your favorite food then?
It used to be tacos, but I've been to Mexico, so I'm fed up. Now it's ramen.
What's your favorite movie?
City of God, or Cidade de Deus in Portuguese, is a Brazilian film based in Rio, which I love, Rio, that I'm obsessed about.
Good, good. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ini. I think it's lighting enough.
Okay, sure, Mr. Lightning. Okay, thank you so much, Adi. It was wonderful chatting to you. I enjoyed this conversation, and I really hope that all of our listeners who have been with us through this episode enjoyed the episode, as well as you have like takeaways that you can begin to implement in your growth design journey. So you know where to find us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate us, leave us reviews. Those type of things are helpful for us. And we will be linking all of the things mentioned, resources in our show notes, as well as, well, on the new website, which is when this episode is going to come out. So, yay.
Whoa.
All
Fancy.
right. Thank you all. It's been great. Bye. Till next
Bye.
time.
Bye, guys.